Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia and dedicated to the proposition articulated by Walter Lippmann during World War II that a strong and balanced foreign policy is the indispensable shield of our democratic republic. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a Bulwark contributor, and a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center. My co-host is Eliot Cohen, the Robert E. Osgood Professor of Strategy at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome, Eliot.
Well, Eric, it's good to be with you. So this week it's just you and me, mano a mano.
It's just the two of us. So lots going on in the world. We should talk about Ukraine, of course, because so much is going on with Ukraine. But we should talk about China as well, because we've had a major incident. We have a looming balloon gap growing between the United States and the People's Republic of China. So should we talk about what in the world Chinese PLA leaders were thinking to launch this thing?
Why don't we start with that?
We can start with that. And then I'd like to talk about Iran, too, if only because so few people are talking about Iran, despite the fact that the protests continue. And it seems to me the administration's Iran policy is either non-existent or in some disarray. So let's start with, ballooning for fun and profit.
So, here are a couple of things that struck me about it. But by the way, I'd also like us to talk a bit about Turkey, since that's a country you know really well, having served as ambassador there. So back to the balloon, there are a couple of things that strike me about it. One, the Pentagon just admitted that we hadn't detected some of the previous balloon incursions, which is quite troubling, actually. I mean, these are not like little balloons. They're really big balloons with big payloads. Secondly, I think the question one has to ask is, is this just a question of bureaucracy does its thing? That part of the PLA that's in charge of balloon reconnaissance does balloon reconnaissance no matter what. And maybe even if they already have satellites and spies who can pick up the same information. Or is this, wolf warrior diplomacy? We're going to show you. Because the Chinese have sent these kinds of balloons over other countries. We're not the only ones. And I wonder, is this a psychological game? What do you think?
Well, first, I want to stipulate, as lawyers would say, that unlike a lot of people who are opining on this subject, I am not a balloon expert. I'm not a lighter-than-air system expert. And one of the things that has struck me about the response over the last several days to this on all sides is that a lot of people are, issuing opinions and obiter dicta about this. And there's still so much, I think, we don't know. There have been reports not only that some of these balloon efforts were undetected, but also reports that several Chinese balloons traversed at least parts of the United States during the Trump administration. Senior Trump administration officials deny that they were ever told about this. So I think there's still a lot that we don't know. And I do think there are things that we need to find out about this. We need to determine, among other things, whether the Biden administration acted as it says it did on the basis of both military advice with regard to the potential collateral damage of taking the balloon down earlier than they did, but also whether the intelligence folks actually did recommend that a lot could be gleaned from allowing this thing to go forward, and whether there were, in fact, measures to sort of mitigate the potential intelligence gains that the PRC might glean from the track of which this balloon took. I mean, because I spend a lot of my life worrying about nuclear weapons, it does strike me that this balloon appears to have traversed a number of our facilities where either ICBMs or B-2 bombers are stationed. And so there may have been some, intelligence purpose related to strategic weapons. If that's true, that's a very serious question that we need to be, poking into. So I say that all as a kind of very long prolegomena to saying, I don't know.
Well, I guess I feel duty bound to point out that there could be a balloon gap emerging here. This is, I believe, not the first time that balloons have had this strategic purpose. You'll know the history better than I do, but I believe early in the Cold War, somebody at CIA got the bright idea of having balloons traverse Soviet airspace, taking lots of pictures. Now, the only problem was back then you had no way of telling where the balloon had been. So they got lots of excellent pictures of nobody knows what because they couldn't control it. And of course, there's a balloon history even further. I have to say I give credit to the Air Force. The call signs for the pilots who shot down the balloon were Frank 01 and Luke 01, named after Second Lieutenant Frank Luke, who received a Medal of Honor during World War I for shooting down 14 German observation balloons in 3 weeks.
Right.
So there's a history here. But on the more serious note, look, this blew up a visit by the Secretary of State to China. Right. The Chinese took this quite strident position, I thought, of denouncing the fact that we had shot this thing down.
Yep.
So you do wonder how to interpret it. I suppose at the end of the day, I mean, like you, I'm completely ignorant on this one. That won't prevent me from opining. I guess my instinct is always to believe that it's stupidity and folly and, one part of the bureaucracy not knowing what the other part is doing and that sort of thing.
Occam's razor would certainly suggest that the most parsimonious explanation is through incompetence. Stupidity. Yeah.
Yeah.
But look, I mean, so the Chinese cover story is it's a weather observation balloon that went off course. Of course, there's another weather observation balloon that went off course over Latin America. If it was a weather observation balloon that went off course and was traversing the United States, perhaps the Chinese government might have wanted to let the United States know about that and say, oops, we're sorry, it shouldn't have happened. But they didn't do that, obviously, and best I can tell, the payload of this balloon was, quite large instrument. You can see the pictures. It looks, as has been described, about 3 buses worth of apparatus attached to the bottom of this balloon that was sensing, whatever it was passing over. So, I think it would be incredibly stupid of the Chinese to have done this as a thumb in our eye if they wanted to, in fact, have high-level meetings with the U.S., which they've been signaling they want to try and get the relationship a little bit less fraught than it's been. They've got a variety of reasons for wanting to do that. So if it was, in fact, an intentional act, it's incredibly stupid, and they have really, I think, underestimated the impact it will have domestically in the United States. If it was an accidental act, then it's, as you say, the kind of mindless workings of the bureaucracy. I think we still don't know what that answer is. And before I reach a judgment, I'd like to see more evidence.
I mean, I think the more serious news which struck me about China is that it turns out that there have been Chinese companies selling parts that are militarily useful to the Russian defense industry. And I think that if that's true, and if it's true on a large scale, that's a big problem. Because one of the things that really is inhibiting Russian defense production is the shortage of chips, in particular, and various kinds of electronics to manufacture the hardware that they've been losing on a titanic scale
replenish
in Ukraine. Yeah, and that if that's true, then I think then things are even darker than we thought, and I tended to think they were pretty dark.
And it's not even just the Chinese, right? It's also that the Iranians are apparently going to export not just these Shahed 136 drones or loitering munitions that they've been supplying the Russians with, but they're going to build them an entire factory for producing these things indigenously in Russia, which is the thing that worried me the most about the opening of the channel from Iran to Russia of lethal military assistance for these, Shahed 136s and Mojahir drones has been not that the Iranians would supply those, but that they would, perhaps also supply even more devastating military goods, including ballistic missiles, of which they have enormous numbers, but also that they would make available to the Russians the very highly developed sanctions evasion mechanisms that they've developed. I mean, they have they're the most sanctioned country in the world, and they have developed a very, very sophisticated system of trying to evade those sanctions. And if they make that available completely to the Russians, that is going to do a lot to undercut Western sanctions. And as the Chinese potential export of military components to Russia would be, very, very bad, and raise the likelihood that we'll be looking at a longer rather than a shorter conflict in Ukraine.
I think that's transitioning us to a discussion of Ukraine. And I have to say, I continue to be baffled by the Biden administration, which on the one hand, more or less does the right kind of thing, but late. And which does not, as they say, lead the target, sort of saying, well, 6 months from now, they're going to need tanks. So why don't we work on getting them there now so they can begin training up on them? And that goes out of its way to say, we're not going to do this, even if later on they do this, and which is still holding back on the kind of weaponry that they really need. I mean, eventually they're finally getting, I guess, with these ground launched small diameter bombs, things which will have 150 kilometer reach or something like that. What they really need is ATACMS, which is a ballistic missile that can really, do things like take out the bridge that goes to Crimea. And on top of all that, and this is the thing that I do find maddening, and this is an extremely consequential war, as you and I have, and guests of ours have discussed. We have yet to have a speech, with possible exception of Lloyd Austin at Halifax, that really spells out to the American people, this is why this matters to us. What's astounding is not softening public support for Ukraine. It's that the support has held up as long as it has held up without the president showing up in the Oval Office and telling the American people, this is why we should all care about it. And I know Biden is not a gifted speaker, but, he can string sentences together when he has to. And I just don't understand why he doesn't, and why his people don't think that he should.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think, American public support, I think has been relatively robust. It's been less robust among self-identified Republicans, and that's in part for reasons we know. It's, got to do with statements by Trump or kind of Trumpist, more isolationist-oriented Republicans, Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio and others who've made comments about this, J.D. Vance, et cetera, either comments calling for an end to the aid or insisting that, there can't be a blank check, which nobody has advocated. But it's no thanks to really the president, and he really should be doing exactly what you say. I mean, I agree with you about what you've called the titrating out of military assistance. I mean, the ground-launched small-diameter bomb is a very useful weapon for the Ukrainians because it'll allow them to attack some of the interstices of Russian logistics that have moved further back, in the face of the M777s and the HIMARS Gimlers rounds that we've given the Ukrainians earlier. And that's good, but as you say, ultimately they're going to need ATACMS. But moreover, I tried to parse the Pentagon's fact sheet and statements about this, and then read the press accounts. I'm still confused about when these things are going to actually show up in Ukraine. And there may be a reason why these are not coming out of U.S. stocks and then being replenished later. But the administration hasn't explained why. But to say we're going to give them this, but it's going to show up in 9 months, when everything seems to suggest that the Russians are looking at some major offensives, in the next 3 weeks, it just is inexplicable to me. I mean, am I missing something?
I'm sure, like you, I hope against hope this is part of some vast deception scheme that actually, there are large stockpiles of these things sitting in Ukraine. And, the day before the Russians launch their big offensive, General Solution gives the order and they blow up all the key command and control centers and ammunition depots. But I don't think so, unfortunately. I also, there's another dimension of this that's inexplicable. So Biden says we're not going to give them F-16s. Well, first, we often end up, saying we won't do it and then we do it. But more importantly, even if we thought it was a bad idea, even if we didn't intend to do it, why make life easier for the Russians by saying we won't do that? I mean, I am genuinely baffled by this, and it's almost like there's kind of a lack of seriousness, or not a lack of seriousness. It's a lack of awareness of what happens when you're in a war.
Yeah.
That you don't make it easy for the other guy,
Yeah.
and you don't reassure him in any way.
So, against my better instinct, let me make sort of what would be the best case argument for the way the administration's approached this, which is that by titrating these things out, you and I are unhappy about it, and other critics who want to give Ukraine everything they need, including former Ambassador Mike McFaul, who was the Obama administration's ambassador to Russia, who has a piece in Foreign Affairs saying, give the Ukrainians everything they need now. Don't do it incrementally. From the administration's point of view, if you're very concerned about the escalation dynamics, you don't want World War III, as the president and Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, have repeated kind of ad nauseum, I would say, then there's something to be said for doling this out bit by bit, kind of like the, sort of geopolitical equivalent of immunotherapy for allergies. If you're worried about the neuralgic Russian reaction, you sort of do these things sort of bit by bit. You say we're not going to do this, but then you do that, and you kind of habituate the Russians to the fact that the Ukrainians are going to get everything they want over time. But you avoid the big kind of explosive reaction from Moscow. And look, to some extent, that has worked, I think. I mean, the Russians have become inured. Now, what I think speaks against that, again, I'm trying to make the best face argument. I'm not endorsing this by any means.
Yeah.
But what stands against that, I think, is there's nothing they can do about this anyway.
Right. That's exactly the point. What are they going to do? Try to blow up Ukrainian power plants? They're doing that anyway.
Right.
There are two other counter arguments I would make. One is there's a profound human cost to this. A long war means tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians and soldiers who are going to be killed and maimed. And, if you plan on helping those people, but you decide to be clever and titrate it, some of that blood is on your hands. If you are deliberately slow rolling it. Secondly, you reinforce the worst instincts of the Olaf Scholzes of this world. So, well, if the Americans don't want to lean in, why exactly should we? Now, the good news there is that you've got the Poles and the Czechs and the Finns and the Estonians and others who are leaning forward. But I think with a lot of the big countries, they can hide behind us. Now, the one thing I would say just about that, it's been interesting watching the French. The French have actually begun amping up their military aid to Ukraine, and Macron, this may just have been, him being exercising a certain amount of Gallic needling of us, said, well, maybe fighter jets should be on the menu.
I would say that's constructive needling.
Yeah. Well, and good for him.
Yeah.
The thing that I'm really interested in here, which I'd like to hear your view. So, have you seen this word intermarium? So between the seas, the idea that there's a distinct region from the Baltics through Eastern Europe, obviously down to the Black Sea, as a kind of a distinct strategic region
Mm-hmm.
in Europe. And the argument, and of course it would be the Poles who would make it, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong, that, this is going to be the kind of center of initiative and leadership within NATO, supported by the United States and Great Britain. And I increasingly tend to think there's something to that. I mean, the Poles are really planning on some monumental purchases of weaponry. I believe I saw that in addition to the M1 Abrams tanks they're buying, they're going to buy a couple of hundred South Korean K2 tanks, which is actually quite a good tank. And then they're going to build a factory or factories to manufacture 700 more. And, that makes them quite a considerable power, and actually a much more considerable military power than Germany is.
Before I respond to that, Eliot, I want to stick with what we were just talking about and advance two more arguments against the idea of immunotherapy or acclimating the Russians to progressively more and more types of armed assistance going to Ukraine. The more this looks like a long war, the more it will excite the kinds of things we saw that just came out in the RAND study, that the way to avoid a long war is to force the Ukrainians to negotiate with the Russians and to make a deal on what would be very unfavorable terms. That, in my view, would be catastrophic for the administration's announced goal of denying the Russians, a strategic victory. In other words, denying them the fruits of their, unprovoked, premeditated aggression against another independent state with whom they had legally binding arrangements not to do this. So that's, point one. Point two is, and this is something that I think came up with our colleague Peter Feaver when we had him on the podcast some months back, but if it didn't, it should have, because of course it's based on a lot of work he has done, which is that support for this kind of thing is very dependent on the prospect of victory. The last thing Americans want is another, endless war. I mean, I hate that locution, as you know, because I think it's mindless and stupid, but it is a reality that if there doesn't seem to be a prospect for victory, support for this will wane. So just on the administration's own terms, it seems to me to be very foolish to not be plunging ahead, giving, the Ukrainians everything they need, particularly to thwart the next series of offensives. And we can talk about the offensives and what's likely to happen. I'm both worried about that, although I think there's some very serious obstacles the Russians are still facing. But on the question of the intermarium and the, I don't, I understand what people are saying, and maybe it will eventuate that way, but I don't think it's that way yet. And I say that because Turkey's position is very ambivalent. So is Bulgaria's. Bulgaria, while it's a NATO member, there's still very extensive Russian influence in Bulgaria. It's a half-hearted, ambivalent, member at all. Romania, better than Bulgaria, but also, a little bit shaky, even though it's a Black Sea riparian state. Then there's, of course, not to mention Hungary, which is, an outlier. Having said that, I do think that the addition of Finland and Sweden to NATO will create a kind of shift inside NATO to the east, because Finland and Sweden are both very serious. They've got serious military capability to bring to bear in the alliance. They think seriously about these problems. I mean, the Finnish and Swedish international institutes, or institutes of international relations, I should say, have studied the Soviet military very carefully. They're very smart about this. They bring serious defense industries to bear in a period of time when the U.S. and Europe both are going to have to rediscover their vocation as the arsenal of democracy to withstand both potentially Russian and Chinese aggression. And along with Poland, as you were describing, and the Baltic states, which have per capita donated probably more than anybody
Yeah.
to the defense of the Ukrainians. I do think you will see them emerging as more and more leaders inside the alliance, and relatively speaking, very pro-American
Yeah.
voices inside the alliance.
Well, this is, your old boss, Don Rumsfeld, talking about old Europe and New Europe. He was not entirely wrong about that. But speaking of all that, maybe we could use that to shift to Turkey. So I suppose, knowing infinitely less about Turkey than you do, my default expectation is, or interpretation, I should say, is that Erdogan is, he's taken the Finns and the Swedes and every other member of NATO into the bazaar. He is a master bargainer. He's going to extract the absolute maximum, particularly from the Swedes. I don't think he cares about the Finns. And at the last minute, he will accede to their joining NATO. What do you think?
Certainly hope so. There are already some signs emerging. He has spoken about, and it's been bruited about in Finland as well, that there may be a Turkish parliamentary approval soon of Finland. I think this is driven in part by concerns about the potential F-16 sale from the United States to Turkey. And then perhaps at some later point, probably after the May 14th Turkish election, and after extracting some more putative concessions from the Swedes, that the Swedes will be, allowed to come in, and all of this will take place before the Vilnius summit. So by the time of the summit, we'll have one big happy, NATO family. That's at least the hope. There are a lot of things that could go wrong here. I mean, Erdogan is, quite mercurial. This Quran burning incident, which, oh, by the way, has all the earmarks of a
Russian provocation. Yeah.
It's a Russian disinformation operation, and
Yeah.
I know that at least some senior Turks know that and are not, under any illusions about that. But Erdogan has either chosen to play on that, or himself is, somehow blind to that. Things like that can happen, and this all can go wrong. Moreover, this is be careful what you wish for, because you might get it. There's no guarantee if he loses the election that the opposition is going to be a whole lot better. In fact, they might be a lot weaker in sort of being able to, deal with whipped up nationalist sentiment that he's created. So, there's no guarantees in life. The earthquake in Turkey, one can hope that it will do some things to ameliorate the regional situation. So, in 1999, there was a very large earthquake in Istanbul, in the Istanbul area, Istanbul and Bursa, but also in Greece. And that led to a bit of a rapprochement between Turkey and Greece, and ultimately actually opened the door, ironically, to the Finns being able to get Turkey's EU candidacy back on the agenda of the EU. I happened to have been U.S. ambassador to Finland at that time when the Finns held the EU presidency for 6 months, the rotating presidency. And, that's all been forgotten by the Turks, of course, now in their current phase. But, the Finns were a driving force in getting their EU candidacy back on. So it may be because of the enormous humanitarian suffering that's going on. This is a very serious earthquake, as best I can tell, and there's a prospect. It seems like the fault lines, there's a lot of stress still in those faults, and there's been some kind of crack, I'm told, that could lead to even, at least another. There was already 2 earthquakes, but it's not just another aftershock, but perhaps another quake. The destruction's already been immense. So one could hope that, that will once again lead to maybe some lessening of regional tensions, maybe less threatening by Turkey of, warfare against Greece, because I think the Greeks are reaching out and offering, humanitarian assistance to deal with the terrible consequences of the earthquake. And really, you read the stories and watch these pictures, and given the weather patterns and the cold and the temperature and the snow, you really feel for the people who've been affected by this. But by the same token, the day before the earthquake, the Interior Minister of Turkey, Recep Soylu, said about our ambassador, my successor, multiple times removed, Ambassador Jeff Flake, get your dirty hands off of Turkey. Keep your dirty hands off of Turkey, he said. I mean, it seems like a very ill-advised comment, in light of what happened 24 hours later, because obviously we're offering, as a lot of assistance as well, humanitarian assistance to deal with this terrible human tragedy. So, I don't know how it's going to play domestically. I fear a little bit that it's going to redound to Erdogan's benefit, because he's going to be kind of in charge. If he has a reasonably competent response to this will help him enormously. Incumbency will help him enormously in the May 14th election.
Trying to be dispassionate about it, I have to say, whatever my personal feelings about Tayyip Erdogan are, he does seem to me to be a very cunning pragmatist who has played, from the point of view of Turkish interests as he understands them, a very successful game with us and with the Russians and the Ukrainians and, everybody else. And it's, there are parts of it which are infuriating, but it's, and I guess the larger thing that I wonder about is maybe this, is an indication of the world that we're heading into, where you have a lot of authoritarian rulers who have multiple motivations, to be sure, but in some ways they're pursuing national interests as they understand it, and they do it frequently in unsavory ways. They're going to be extremely transactional, and they may well be successful because the nature of the international system in which we're operating now is that there's just much more fluidity. There are, more states that are at odds with us, at odds with the West. You'll have marriages of convenience and so forth. And so I think this is our future. I remember very early on, Eric, when you and I talked about literally 20 years ago, about, would the Turks allow the 4th Infantry Division to come through Turkey? Well, the idea is that the Turks, of course, are our allies. And yes, they've got a domestic problem, to be sure, with allowing this. And, shouldn't Colin Powell have gone to pay a visit? But the basic assumption that these are our allies, difficult allies. But now I have to say, I don't particularly think of the Turks as allies. I think they're a power that we deal with and that will sometimes align with us and sometimes not.
I think that's clearly right. Erdogan has been very successful, if your role model is Rod Blagojevich. His interpretation of Turkish national interests is extremely coincident with his own personal political interest, which is what really drives everything for Erdogan. And while he's been, successful at some level, certainly nobody's made money betting against him in Turkish politics over the last 20 years, right? He's won every election that he's been in, although there have been a couple of close calls, particularly back in June of 2015. But there's a cost here, I think. I think in particular, the veto of Finland and Sweden, which came after he had assured leaders in both countries that he had no objection, I think has actually exacted a bit of a price inside NATO. I think there's real anger and fury at the Turks for the way that they're playing this. Now, people are not vocalizing it so much, I think, because since NATO operates on consensus and the Turks can block all this, I think they've been able to shield themselves a little bit from some of the anger that I've detected when talking to other diplomats about this. I'm not sure that will last forever. I think after the Hungarians get around this month, I hope, to approving this, and it's only the Turks who are holding out, I think there's going to be more of that. And if he ends up blocking, even if he ends up acceding to Finland, but blocking Sweden for a long time, and certainly after the Vilnius summit, I think there'll be quite a lot of anger. And, there's no mechanism to do what John Bolton suggested in an op-ed not long ago, kicking Turkey out of NATO, but I think you'll hear more people talking about that. More people will be starting to speculate about that. I mean, and as you say, they're a highly situational and transactional ally. You know, they're content to be an ally and a member of NATO when it suits their purpose, but to pretend that they have no obligations to the United States or any other ally when it doesn't. And you can see that, for instance, in their, really kind of not very thorough application. They've refused to enforce sanctions themselves, and they've had to be badgered, constantly by the Department of Treasury, and particularly the Deputy Treasury Secretary Wally Adeyemo, who's been out there in Turkey and been on the phone constantly with his counterparts, trying to get the Turks to live up to their obligations to sanction certain activities. And they've done some things, like they've unplugged their payment system from the mirror payment system that was being used. But there's also, there's $28 billion worth of, quote, errors and omissions on their IMF balance sheet, which, almost everybody believes is, Russian oligarch and other money flooding into Turkey. Suits Erdogan's purposes right now because it's floating the Turkish economy in the run-up to the election, which is suffering from, 85% inflation, which is due to his economic mismanagement of the place.
Eric, I think one of the things that I wonder about is if the Turkish case is not an isolated case. I think about Hungary. If NATO, which was something very different when, 30 or 40 years ago from what it is now, much larger, much more diverse views. If you're seeing a number of people who we sort of thought of as allies or partners, but are really intensely transactional, what does this mean for the style of American foreign policy going forward? And I guess I would posit two things. One is that it would behoove us to look to create smaller, closer groupings of really like-minded countries. In a way, I think that's part of what AUKUS is about, and AUKUS plus Japan, so JAUKUS. I think that is something that we'll probably be seeing more of in Europe. And it's not that we'll just try to dismantle Europe, try to dismantle NATO, rather. But the actual international action is going to happen in smaller groupings of countries that really can think of one another as allies and as partners. And I think conversely, it means that we actually need to cultivate a somewhat harder transactional edge in dealing with the Hungaries and Turkeys of this world. So, I'm quite pleased that Congress is saying, no admission to NATO for Sweden and Finland, no F-16s. But I think there's probably a lot more that we can do than that. And, particularly towards the Hungarians, who in some ways have been quite despicable. I have no problem with really twisting their arms. And I think we're going to have to get used to doing that. And that's not been the style of American foreign policy. And it shouldn't be the general style, vis-a-vis countries that really are close to us. But vis-a-vis these other countries, I think that's the direction we should probably move in. What do you say to that?
Two things. One, I very much agree that, and I've thought for some time, that we need more kind of multilateral approaches in East Asia, where we have traditionally had these, bilateral hub and spoke relationships, and as you say, AUKUS and bringing the Quad, and Japan, if we could ever get Japan, South Korea, and the U.S. all aligned, we never seem to be able to do that because the internal politics of South Korea and Japan are never in phase with one another. But we need to, I think, do that in East Asia. And then we need more what I guess I would call mini-lateralism inside NATO, which is, it's not exactly a coalition of the willing, but working with, the Poles and the Finns and Swedes once they're in, and the Balts and others, to advance sort of common interests. I think that is, very much the wave of the future. And we definitely need to be more transactional with the Hungarians and the Turks and other problematic allies. And you're right, that's very much goes against the grain of the career American Foreign Service. It's really what you and I have discussed in the past, what the French call la déformation professionnelle. The American Foreign Service, you get promoted, you get ahead in the profession by smoothing the rough edges off, relationships, not actually highlighting them. And so that's very countercultural. But I think we have to do it. Look, to give you some sense of how hard this is, Jake Sullivan and I, back in 2018, wrote an op-ed together for Politico about how the United States needed to get more transactional with Erdogan and with the Turks. And, Jake's now national security advisor. And I think the Biden administration's had a lot of difficulty actually applying this. It's very hard, actually, particularly when you got a country like, probably easier with Hungary, but with a country like Turkey, where you've got so many interests in it, it's harder to actually apply this. We are, by the way, on Turkey going to have the redoubtable Henri Barkey, who has an article out in Foreign Affairs about the impact of the Turkish election, coming on the show very soon. So we should have him on in about 2 weeks' time. So hold these thoughts, because we need to go we need to go into them with Henri.
Well, I would just add one last thing, though, on that. You made a point about the career of foreign service, but I think it goes beyond that. And maybe one way of putting it is that I think for a lot of people, certainly in the foreign service, but in the foreign, that part of the, think tank, intellectual, policy community, people think more about foreign relations than they do about foreign policy. And there's a real distinction there.
Yep.
You can have very good foreign policy that doesn't necessarily mean that you have great foreign relations, at least in some areas. And like I said, I wouldn't apply this universally. I mean, I don't think the United States is not going to have a Metternickian kind of policy where we just, think of everybody else as chess pieces to try to move around the board. But we are going to have that approach to a number of countries, and not let ourselves get trapped in saying, well, we can't damage the relationship.
Agree, totally. It runs against the American grain, actually, to do this, I think. It's a little bit out of our national character. It's one reason why I think Henry always had a lot of trouble imposing, a realpolitik foreign policy on the United States. It just doesn't sit well with Americans who, want to assume the best about people for the most part, and have trouble, I think, kind of particularly when they're dealing with countries that are nominally allies, sort of, exacting these kinds of.
Well, and to be, I mean, I think that, it's complicated, because there are those countries with which maintaining the relationship is critical. I watched you almost single-handedly rebuild the relationship with France. That is a relationship, even when the French are difficult and we irritate them and they really irritate us. They're not like Hungary.
No, of course.
They're not like Turkey.
Yeah, I do want to, before we wrap, because we're running out of time, I do want to get back to the question of Iran for a moment. And that is because it bothers me enormously that, even though we're in like day 140 something of the protests in Iran, and although there have been, upwards of perhaps 30,000 people detained and maybe as many as 1,000 killed, although I think the numbers might be a little below that. It's like falling off the face of the earth for Americans. You could barely find any news about this, and it is hugely important, particularly at a time when Iran is, as we were talking about earlier, is becoming a main military supplier for Russia, and is continuing to violate and moving kind of into higher violations of the limits that were set in the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement that was reached in 2015. And yet, it seems like the Biden administration is saying, on the one hand, the JCPOA is dead, but we kind of don't really have, a real alternative policy, although they seem to be struggling to find one. So we have had Juniper Oak, this really huge U.S.-Israeli military exercise, which I think is a step in the right direction. But the administration seems to be balking at what Ray Takei and I advocated in the pages of Foreign Affairs recently. We were asked to do a update of our article from 2020 when we advocated that the United States ought to do everything it can to support regime change in Iran. Not, by the way, imposed by U.S. military force, but helping the Iranian people do what they clearly want to do themselves.
Yeah. Part of the incoherence on our side is the administration is divided against itself. You've got Robert Malley as, the chief guy on Iran policy, who is clearly deeply committed to the JCPOA. He had helped to negotiate it. It's also clear the president's quite skeptical of it. So, like, what gives? There's that. I think I also think that there's a certain amount of fatalism, and this is a broader issue. And I wonder if this has infected our elites and Western elites more broadly, which is, people just being resigned to the idea that modern authoritarian regimes have such good mechanisms of control and repression that they really can't be overthrown by popular upheaval. Now, that's actually a serious argument, and maybe we should try to there are people who've written about this, and maybe we should try to bring them on the podcast. But that's, for me, is one of the most concerning things. That it's a brutal regime, of course, that they'll use violence, of course, but even violent regimes have been taken down by really large crowds in the street. And you just somehow get a sense that because people like the Chinese kind of share the techne of repression in terms of skill, concepts, hardware, training,
software,
it's facial recognition technology, all that stuff.
Right.
It's just really hard to have the kind of upheaval in the streets that has historically been one way that, rotten, corrupt dictatorships are taken down,
including in Iran, which has had a history of
yes, of course,
popular rebellion against rulers, corrupt and hated rulers. Look, it's an open question, and I don't think we know the answer yet. But hopefully, we can get some folks on who are smart about this and help enlighten us.
Yeah, I agree. Well, as usual, we have very little cheerful to say. But I will take up the challenge that I think you advanced in our interview with Phil Taubman. John McLaughlin and I can come on together and we can talk about magic and what it has to do with intelligence and foreign policy and strategy.
I think that would be wonderful. I think that would be magical.
Indeed, it would.
Well, with that, we didn't really get to the question of Russian potential military operations and new offensives in Ukraine, but we can hold that for another day because I think it's coming, and we can talk about the prospects for success and timing and where this might happen on a subsequent podcast. But as always, you've left me smarter than I was at the beginning of this.
Well, same here, my friend.